today I'm very pleased to have with me, who's actually right next to me, Charlie Breiner, who is going to be giving his presentation on the events that lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor. So I will say though, if you guys don't mind muting yourselves, I'll probably go through and check because that background noise and phones and talking can be very distracting. So I'd love to have you possibly mute yourselves. I know you probably will have questions. If you do, I would appreciate it if you would hold them until the end. I'm sure Charlie won't mind answering them at the end. Okay, so I think we're gonna start.
You see, this is the events leading to Pearl Harbor, and I have on there Shakespeare's quote, "What's past is prologue." And my view of history is that one event leads to another. And so I'm going to start this story way back in 1853 in July, when Commodore Mathew Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay, and he demanded that Japan open 4 ports for trade. He also wanted better treatment for stranded sailors. Japan simply killed them. Japan promptly rejected his request. This goes back to the 1600s when Japan first saw Western Europeans on their shores, and they decided they wanted no contact. They did not want any interference with their culture, their society, their social order. So they rejected Commodore Perry's request. Well, he returned, and a year later, in 1854, with 7 warships, and negotiated this treaty with at gunpoint, threatening to shell Tokyo. Now the Japanese are very smart. They saw what was happening to China and Japan, and they were greatly humiliated by this Treaty of Kanagawa on March 30th, 1854, which opened 3 ports and met other demands. And this brought foreign money in, which caused inflation. Great Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands obtained similar concessions, one-sided. Now, the Japanese are very smart people. They looked around and they saw what was happening in China. You had Great Britain with taking Hong Kong and the Opium Wars, and Germany got a piece of it. Russia was in Port Arthur. France, Austria, Germany, they all had a little piece, Chinese port, and they would exercise their own laws, their own, rather than Chinese, and their what amounted to possessions in China. And Japan, if they didn't already have, kind of looked on the Chinese as kind of weak and disorganized, and for allowing this to happen. But Japan at this time was a shogunate. They didn't have a strong central government. They were kind of a feudal society with shoguns running feudal domains and a very weak central government. So the Meiji Restoration took place in 1867 when the Emperor Meiji was established, and this was called the Meiji Restoration. And it established a strong central government. The shogunates were eliminated. The samurai warrior class was abolished, and a national army and navy were established. Uh, However, many of the samurai became officers in the new army, which added their value system to it. Now Japan, they knew they needed to modernize, so they sent commissions all over the world, particularly to the United States, France, England, Germany, Austria, and they studied everything about Western government, banking, corporate structures, even postal systems, and military, army, navy organization. And they chose the British Navy for obvious reasons at this time to model their own navy after. They initially decided to use the French model for their army, but with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, they changed their mind and adopted the Prussian General Staff model. So they started this industrialization. However, they had one simple problem. Well, it wasn't simple, it was major. Japan has no natural resources from which to develop a modern economy from, which led them to look to their neighbors. And they slowly established industry, and they originally they had their Navy ships built in Great Britain, a few of the smaller ones in France. At first, their objective with their Navy was simply to defend their ports and their coastal lines from foreign intervention. Their army was reorganized again and modernized. And this brings us to the first Sino-Japanese War, which was fought in 1894 to 1895. They invaded and took Korea and Taiwan from China. They pushed into Manchuria and took the Liaodong Peninsula. The Japanese Navy and land victories resulted in 35,000 Chinese to 5,000 Japanese casualties. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, April 17, 1895, Japan gained Korea. Taiwan, the Liaodong Peninsula, Korea, they looked at Korea as a dagger pointed right at Japan. And Korea also had was a source of coal and iron for Japanese industry. China also paid 200 million tassels of silver to Japan, and this led to the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 in exchange for 30 million taels of silver. The Boxer Rebellion, China tried to throw out all the foreign occupiers. This was put down by the militaries of all the Western powers, including the United States. Japan did provide the largest contingent of troops, and they put down this rebellion rather brutally. Russia, France, and Germany compelled Japan to cede the Liaodong Peninsula to Russia in exchange for financial compensation. Japan did not particularly like this idea. They felt they'd been screwed by the European powers. However, Japan and Great Britain concluded a treaty in 1902 that if either were attacked by a third party, the other would come to the other's aid. Japan, in an effort to win the Liaotung Peninsula of Port Arthur, Japan invaded Manchuria in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. Japan will take Port Arthur. They will siege the Liaotung Peninsula. Now, if you look at the map, there we go. You see, they marked the battles with X's. They took Port Arthur from the Russians. They moved north along the Chinese-Manchurian Railroad, and they took Manchuria from Russia. Now, Japan was broke. They'd won all the battles, but they were broke. Russia was terribly humiliated. Actually, this kind of led to the revolution of 1905 that began in Russia. They had the crowd move on the Tsar's palace in St. Petersburg, which were ridden down by the Cossacks, and they had mutinies on their ships. However, Russia sent their fleet, their Baltic fleet, to the Pacific to break the siege of Port Arthur. Now, if you look at the map of the Russian fleet, the movement from the Baltic to the Pacific, here we go. It took them 11 months. Some of the bigger ships went around the coast of Africa. Some of the smaller ones went through the Suez Canal. They recoaled in Madagascar and proceeded. By this time, Port Arthur had already been taken by the Japanese, so they attempted to go to Vladivostok. They were ambushed in the Strait of Tsushima by Admiral Togo, and the Russian fleet was completely destroyed. The first ship sunk was that's the Battle of Tsushima with Admiral Togo on his flagship at the beginning of the battle. And this was the Russian battleship. It was the first one sunk at Tsushima. This was a very famous battle in Japanese. Back one. No.
Forward one.
There. They preserved the flagship with a statue of Admiral Togo. It's still in Japan. And as I said before, Japan was broke. They spent a fortune on this war. They'd won all the battles. They won the naval battle. So at this point, President Theodore Roosevelt sent William Howard Taft, who was Governor General of the Philippines, to Tokyo to see if the Japanese would be interested in making peace. They were. So President Roosevelt intervened. The treaty negotiations took place in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the Portsmouth Naval Yard. There's the envoy reception. And they'll see the treaty building where the treaty was actually negotiated, and the hotel where they stayed, which I believe is still standing up in New Hampshire. The Treaty of Portsmouth was signed September 5th, 1905. Manchuria, including Port Arthur and the Liaotung Peninsula, was returned to China. Japan's rule of Korea was formally recognized. Japan was given the southern half of the island of Sakhalin in exchange for dropping the demand for reparations from Russia. Japan was, however, given control of the southern Manchuria Railroad and mining concessions along that. Now you can imagine how the Japanese felt about this. They felt they'd been royally screwed because they had won all the battles, they had conquered Manchuria, the whole thing, Port Arthur, and it's taken away from them. This left a very bitter taste in their mouth, particularly with the U.S., because we had helped negotiate this treaty. However, the Japanese did retain control of the railroad and much of the industry and mining operations that were along it. And this went on until 1931. On September 18th, the Japanese army, without the knowledge of the civilian government, the Kuomintang army in Manchuria, set off an explosion near the railroad. Here you see a picture of it. Did not do any damage to the railroad. However, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria, and they set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. And Japan had little trouble overrunning Manchuria. And they stayed in Manchuria from 1931 till 1935. When on 1935, on July 7th, they had the incident at Marco Polo Bridge, which was on the border between Manchuria and China. Again, this is something provoked by the Japanese. There was some skirmishing along the bridge and in that general area because of probes by the Japanese into the Chinese territory. Japan launched the Second Sino-Japanese War, and Japan invaded China outright. They went up the Yangtze River. The capital of China at this time was Nanking on the Yangtze River. This was the Chinese nationalist capital of Chiang Kai-shek. There were the USS Panay was a patrol boat, a gunboat on the river to kind of keep the river open for commerce. As Japan was moving to take Nanking, the Japanese airplanes attacked the Panay and sunk it on December 12th with Americans and foreign embassy staff on board. This got home. This was covered in the press back in the United States. Japan said it was a mistake and apologized and paid some reparations. However, this left a very, very sour note in the U.S. and there were protests. Japan was starting to be kind of unpopular in the United States. And it should be, I have to mention that the United States was Japan's biggest trading partner at this time. Japan was getting almost all of their oil from the United States, easily 80% at least, and many other things. They were buying up scrap metal for their industry. Japan was, again, our biggest trading partner. The U.S. was very critical of Japan's invasion of China. Uh, they were not happy at all. Japan also had been not too pleased with the Washington naval treatment back in the 1920s when their Navy was limited to 3/5 of the capital ships that the United States and Great Britain were at. They felt they had been discriminated against because of their race, that they were deliberately being held back from great power status. So there was a lot of resentment in Japan. And of course, now resentment was starting to build in the United States for the invasion of China. They sunk the Panay on December 12th. On December 13th, Nanking, the capital of nationalist China, fell. And this led to a 6-week pillage of murder, rape, just wholesale murder and rape and torture, an orgy of killing and rape. The Japanese actually held contests for their officers of who could behead 100 Chinese the quickest. The results were printed and published in the Tokyo newspapers. And word of this was also coming back into the United States. This was in the United States papers too. There were correspondents from the New York Times, the Chicago newspapers in Nanking at the time. And again, public opinion of the Japanese was not the best of the United States, to say the least. That might be an understatement. In 1939, the United States terminated the 1911 commercial treaty with Japan. In 1940, in July 2nd, FDR signed the Export Control Act that gave the president authority to prohibit the export of essential defense materials to Japan. And this was followed by Japanese demands on French Indochina. French Indochina consists of what's today Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The French capital was Hanoi, and the Japanese were concerned about supplies getting into China being landed in the port of Haiphong. That's a very poor map, but Haiphong is up, you're right about there. And then the Chinese, the railroad went up through north into China. And China was receiving ammunition and other supplies via Haiphong and the railroad. And Japan wished to eliminate this. Well, there was such a protest from Roosevelt, and Vichy France was not very happy with it. And also, Japan was kind of concerned with the Russian troops that were on the Manchurian border. So that they were kind of hesitant, and they did back off in 1940, in October of early in 1940. However, when Germany went into Russia in June of 1940 and 41, that kind of took that right off the table. So in 1941, in July, Japan moved in and took over all of Indochina from Vichy France. And on July 31st, 1940, Roosevelt had already embargoed. In 1941, when Japan took all of Indochina, on July 26, 1941, FDR seized all Japanese assets in the United States, and 1 week later embargoed all oil and gas, as did the Dutch East Indies. Japan loses 80% of their imported oil, as well as all aviation fuel. Japan sent 2 negotiators to Washington, D.C. These were honorable men. They were diplomats, Admiral Nomura and his assistant Kurosawa. And they were attempting to do some negotiation, but they were sincere, but the Japanese government was...
Can you hear me?
The civilian Koniye, the prime minister, resigned, and Tojo, who had been the Japanese minister for war, became prime minister. And while the Navy was very hesitant, the Japanese Navy, to go to war with the United States, they had a better global view than, say, the Japanese Army. But the Army was pretty much the driving force now at this point in the government. And there were some negotiations back and forth. The Japanese government offered to withdraw from China in 10 years if the President Roosevelt would relax the sanctions. Then they offered to withdraw from southern French Indochina. And finally, Roosevelt and Cordell Hull had on November 1st, on November 26th, they demanded that Japan withdraw from both China and Indonesia. They surely knew this was not going to happen. By November 5th, Japan had already made the decision to go to war. And I think Roosevelt, when he froze their assets and really put them in a bind economically, he had to know they were not going to back off. There was no way that the Orientals would lose, that they have such a value of losing face, that they could not do this. So there we are on the way to Pearl Harbor. And with that, the rest is history.